Welcome to Booked, where two guys tell you about the books they're reading. I'm Livius Nedden.
And I'm Rob Olson. I'm going to pause you right there because should we call this podcast Booked for what this episode is?
Oh, Heard? Does Heard
I was
work?
thinking audiobooked, but
Audiobook.
Heard,
you know what? I think I like
listened.
audiobook better. Let's start over.
All right.
So here's the funny part for anybody who's listening. I totally wanted to start this over, and the fact that we've slightly changed the name of the podcast made me completely forget how we start the podcast. Welcome to Audiobooked, where two guys tell you about the books they're listening to in their cars. I'm Livius Nedden.
And I'm Rob Olson. The audiobook that we're going to be talking about this episode is Radicals by Nik Korpon. Here is a little bit about Nik Korpon. He is the author of several books, including The Soul Standard and Stay God, Sweet Angel. He lives in Baltimore with his wife and two children. We're going to do the thing we always do. There's something missing from the bio.
It's odd, too, because my first thought was not that, oddly enough. I was like, man, we've reviewed 50% of the books that are in his bio, but really, we've reviewed two other books of his, and what's that other thing that's missing?
Are you talking about the booked anthology? Because he was definitely in the booked anthology.
He was totally in the booked anthology. Yes, of course. Yeah, I knew that. It's okay. Yeah. It's all right. I mean, it's not like we would deduct points from the score of someone's book for them getting their bio that wrong, right?
Oh, we're not. I have to go change some numbers.
So crickets, yeah. This is where if we were like a highly produced podcast, there would have been crickets chirping there. So.
I'm going to make a promise to change that in post, but then not change it in post.
Perfect. Then we will. Nothing will have changed since episode 1, and that's exactly the way I like it. It's funny not to change the subject, but I've been noticing when I watch like YouTube videos that people will be like, "Oh, just click on the link that's like up here somewhere," and like half the time a link doesn't get inserted. Yeah, but.
They figured it out. They cracked the code that I cracked back in the day when I'd say, well, I'm going to put a link in the show notes and then never even bother.
Exactly. And we'll never know how many people wouldn't have clicked that link if it was there. So anyway, back to tonight's audiobook for all you audiobook lovers. Here's the synopsis for Radicals. Jay Brodsky is an enigma to his fellow agents at the FBI Cybercrimes Division, to his new partner, even to himself. For someone whose skills are beyond question, he often seems just on the edge of losing control. He seldom speaks about his family and his personal life, but he seems to be hiding something, and he has an unusual obsession with even the most obscure punk rock. So when a mysterious cyber-terrorist organization begins erasing Americans' medical debt, Jay must put his personal issues aside to focus on an attack that threatens to destabilize the U.S. economy. But when the trail leads to his own family, Jay will be forced to confront everything he never knew about his parents and his long-missing sister and decide where his true loyalties lie. With his country and his mind racing toward a breaking point, can Jay find the answers before everything descends into chaos?
Bum, bum, bum.
I'm going to just go out on a limb and say that he will probably find the answers.
I mean, yeah. Here's the joke. The joke I'm going to make about the synopsis is it doesn't mention the hurricane. There's a hurricane in the book, but it's not essential to the plot. But it would be a funny thing to say. As far as synopses go, I think this is pretty good. It's interesting, and I'm sure we're going to get into it. But it plays on the idea of terror at a great scale, like destabilizing the U.S. economy. So we'll just have to talk about like the scale of what the story is, because it also felt very like Baltimore specific.
Yeah,
which doesn't come through in this. So yeah, we'll talk about that. But like, I think that as far as the synopsis goes, this is actually probably one of the better ones we've gotten as far as like representing what the story's about.
I would agree. The one thing I will say, because needless to say, I did not read the synopsis before listening to the book, mostly because there was not an audio version of the synopsis for me to listen to keep it really like in tune with this week's episode. I almost feel like the synopsis went too far a little bit, and I don't know how much of that we'll talk about, but I think you'll understand what I mean.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what I made that one observation. But yeah, I'll agree with you.
So the book kicks off with a break-in, at a small medical facility, like a doctor's office, and that is the kickoff to what's talked about in the synopsis. So I'll kind of go a little bit further into that story, but there is a group of people, and they have started breaking into medical facilities and basically uploading a virus of sorts that erases patients' billing information, which would then cause there to not be a record of what money is owed by people who are patrons of that medical facility. And we'll probably get into how this grows through the course of the story, but that's really the catalyst event. And the reason for it is they start with one clinic and it erases, but as a virus, it also is able to move through networks of other medical facilities that are in that particular network. So I don't know, Rob, how much time you spend at the doctor, right? But like if you go and you have to get a referral, like your referral just sends you to someone that's in their particular network. So I haven't been to a doctor in a few years, but the last time I went to see a general practitioner about an issue I was having with my hand. And he said, oh, you've got to go see a bone and joint specialist. And he sent me to like the bone and joint specialist that is in their network. So I'm assuming that's, had this have happened at my doctor's office, the billing information for both of those visits would have been gone, and I wouldn't have been out like $75 or whatever that whole thing cost me.
Is everything okay though? Like the bones and joints are all good?
Yeah, oddly enough, it wasn't a bone or a joint. I had either pinched or somehow had like a nerve was inflamed that was causing me like issues with grip and stuff. So they gave me 2 shots of cortisone, and that was the end of it.
So I'm totally going to derail the conversation right away because now I'm like thinking about this in network kind of bullshit. Because recently I went and got an eye exam because I needed new glasses, and I know that the reason they recommended the type of glasses they recommended was because I told them I now sit in front of a computer for my job. Like I'm in front of a computer 8 hours a day. Had I not said that, like, I know that they would have recommended different types of lenses, but they're like, you need to get these specific types of glasses with this like technology that helps with people who work in front of screens all day. And so later on I looked up, I didn't buy any glasses that day. I was like, I'm here for the exam. Give me the exam. I'm going to do my research, see what I'm covered, under my insurance. And then I'm going to buy glasses later on. And then I looked up what they were, and it was just like exclusive to certain like optometrists, like eye doctors or whatever. And I was like, all right, so they're just selling the thing that they're like paying someone to like be able to sell. So I didn't buy those.
While we're on the subject of optometrists, if you're an optometrist, I'm really sorry that I'm saying this. I almost don't feel like, okay, so I think there's 2 different types of optometrists, right? So I think when you go to like lens crafters or insert whatever chain, is most familiar to you, I almost feel like they're not doctors. I almost feel like any of us could do that job with like 2 weeks worth of training. I'm sure they're like I don't know, would it be an optometrist? Like if you go get surgery on your eye, you don't go to lens crafters. It's definitely not that guy that's doing it, right?
Right.
So I don't know. Maybe there are 2 different types of eye doctors. Like the one that's like, read line 3.
Right.
And then there's the one that's like, all right, you have an inflamed cornea and we're going to have to remove it, or whatever happens when you have like eye surgery, right?
Right. Yeah.
So I don't know, man. I think those optometrists, I hope we don't have any optometrist listeners.
We're losing our whole optometrist audience right now.
Well, wait for it, because I'm gonna eliminate another category. They're probably like the chiropractors.
Yeah.
Right. Where they're not really doctors. Like.
Well, so in my experience in the eye exam, like they did the thing where they flipped the thing and like, which is better, 1 or 2? Right. And then you tell them and they're like, how about now, 1 or 2? Like he did that whole thing, but then they did like a retinal screening. They actually like took a picture of my the inside of my eye, and then based on what it looked like, they said, "Oh, you might have glaucoma, so we're going to continue, every 6 months taking a picture of the optic nerve to see if anything changes." So like, but I feel like, yeah, if someone told me what to do with the flippy thing, 1 or 2,
right? Yeah.
And then told me, hey, when you're looking at the optic nerve, here's the warning signs to look for. I don't need 4 years of 4, 6, 8 years of medical school to get through at least like an eye exam, which is probably 90% of what those guys do.
We're gonna have to do a whole episode where we expose the optometrists, I think,
going undercover and shit.
Yeah, let's do that. They do the thing where they blue like the air in your eye. Yeah, that's fucking weird. That's all I've got to say about that. I don't know what that does. All I know is I was like, all right, come on. How serious is this? You're like blowing air in my eye. Like, this just seems like a fun party prank.
Right. So, all disrespect of optometrists aside, I guess we should probably talk about the book.
Yes. So then we catch up with our protagonist, Jay Brodsky, who's an FBI agent. To give you a little bit of background on him, he's been out of the academy for about 7 years. We're very specifically told that it's odd that he was selected to work in his hometown, but that somebody, his boss, who we may or may not get into, Brett, basically saw his marks. He did very well in school. He kind of brought him in to the local FBI department. What are they, like, office? FBI office? It would be an FBI office,
It was
right?
an office, yeah.
Yeah. Brought him into the local FBI office, and he's worked there for 7 years. Now, going back a little bit in Jay's life, right around the time he joined the FBI was when he had a falling out with his sister, who may or may not continue to come up in this particular review, but she does come up in the book from time to time. So we have all of that, and there's still more backstory, which I'm sure Robb will get into. But essentially, he gets to work, and this gets dropped on his desk. Like, hey, there's this weird break-in, cybercrime. There's weird shit coming up on their computer. Need you to look into it.
All right, and I think this is going to be the first part of me acknowledging the difference between experiencing a book as an audiobook versus what I'm accustomed to, which is either an ebook or a print book. I feel like retention is different because while I don't think that I wasn't paying attention, like the stuff in the beginning of the book is way fuzzier for me than the stuff that happened, middle to end of the book. But so essentially, just in general, I want to talk about there's another FBI agent that pops up from time to time. He also works in this cyber crimes kind of team that Brodsky's in. His name is Yemen, and I can't remember his ethnicities, but it's an odd combination of ethnicities. But he's like in the audiobook, like a real hard like New York accent. I don't know. You would probably agree with me with that, right?
Some type of East Coast for sure. I don't know that I could pinpoint, but yeah, definitely an East Coast accent.
Maybe it's Baltimore. Like, I don't know. I've been to Baltimore, but like it was on a weird I went to a Cinco de Mayo party for like part of a day, but I was staying in Maryland. I don't know. Anyway, or I was staying in another part of Maryland. So maybe it is Baltimore, and I just didn't have enough time in the city to like pick up on it. But like he's got a very East Coast, yeah, like, oh, what do you think about this kind of accent? So, and while he's part of the primary team, we don't see Yemen very much. He kind of just pops up from time to time because Jay is the protagonist and he's the one that we follow the most. But essentially, like, Jay finds out about what's going on, and the trigger of why this case is important to them is that there was a hack that happened at this medical office that deleted, like Livius mentioned before, the medical like billing history for that specific office. And so because there was a hack, that's why they have to kind of like jump into action to try and find out what the hell's going on.
During the early course of the investigation, they figure out that it has spread to other facilities, but very quickly, another break-in happens. So they're starting to see that this is moving very, very quickly. And the second one, if I remember correctly, is at an insurance company, which obviously, kind of takes care of the same thing. So it's pretty reasonable for them to come to the conclusion that this is some type of activist group that's working to wipe out the medical debt. So to expound, and so we don't have to keep coming back to this through the course of the story, it's cited pretty early in the book how many billions of dollars are spent a year on the medical industry. So the stakes become very high very quickly for the FBI, and that's where we kind of go back to this destabilizing the U.S. economy, although things continue to expand through the course of the book. I guess I'd just like to sum up so we don't have to keep coming back to it, is that this keeps getting bigger and bigger and eventually could collapse the entire economy of the United States, which, by the way, also then concerns me that there's only like a handful of FBI agents working on it and not like a massive team. And I get like this is fiction storytelling, obviously, but I think once the hints of that would happen, right, it would be a massive organization. It probably wouldn't even be the first guy to get it that gets to hold on to it. You know what I mean? That's where you'd bring in the big dogs. Would be my thought, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, and some thoughts on that. So I want to acknowledge that as far as the narrative goes, we do see this story from multiple perspectives, including at some points the antagonist group, like the ones that are doing these crimes, as early on as the first hack that happens. And I think what's notable about that is, besides the so there was 3 people in the team, and there's almost like a Goldilocks kind of like mama bear, papa bear, baby bear thing, because like one's the big guy, one's the really small guy, and one's like the muscular one, which was an interesting choice. But so there's these 3 people, and notably, at least for me, in the first crime when that was being committed, they didn't seem really keen on being violent against people. They were more just focused on like in and out as efficiently as possible, leave as little evidence, and like if we can do this without anybody ever knowing, that's the goal. So they don't seem violent when the crimes are being perpetrated. They seem like they're very focused on the specific job that they're there for.
Yeah, and for the remainder of this review, we can refer to them as the Crimson Ghosts. It's what the FBI refers to them as. Now, Rob, when that was introduced and it was explained that Brodsky recognizes the skull that like shows up in the like virus, were you immediately able to picture what that looked like?
Not until they mentioned the band The Misfits, but then once that happened, I was like, all right.
Yeah, I didn't until it was mentioned as their logo or whatever, their little, whatever.
Right.
Their emoji, I guess, for any kids that are listening, it's their emoji. But yeah, I was curious. I was thinking about that because there are I don't know, 70 punk rock bands referenced in this book, and yeah. I will give Nick some credit because some of them are big enough, that I recognized them. Some are very clearly fictitious because they're like, they're like, I don't even want to say characters in the story, but characters that are part of the story. So, they're fictitious.
Right.
But then there was a bunch in the middle that I was like, I don't know if he's making these up or not.
Yeah. Same thing here.
So I think that was handled pretty well. Yeah. So, at any rate, back to the FBI. As they realize how important this is, they do bring in a team member, an FBI team member from another city. Her name is Vargas. She's was involved in kind of a high-profile case, even though she's not the one that cracked it. So they bring her in. It was some type of mob or something case. So they bring her in, and she partners with Brodsky. And they get on they get out and slap what's the old term that you used to slap in leather or whatever, I don't know, whatever kind of boots on the ground.
Pavement,
pound the pavement, that'll work too.
Slapping leather, I was like, that was 50 Shades of Grey.
Well, that was yeah, maybe that was in the remake of 50 Shades of Grey. So basically the rest of it essentially is an FBI story, but it doesn't take long for Brodsky to figure out that there are some elements of this that might be a little closer to home than just like a band he recognized as the logo for the activist / terrorist group.
Yeah. So expanding on Agent Brodsky a little bit, I know Livia's touched on some stuff right at the beginning, but in addition to being an FBI agent who's been basically on the job for about 7 years, something that becomes very important to his story, or at least like his personality, is his family life growing up, but then also the fact that, you know, around the time he joined the FBI was when, like Livia said before, he had a kind of falling out with his sister, and he hasn't talked to her in a long time, and she was more or less like the person who raised him after a certain point, because they lost their mother tragically, but then also their father was kind of like a deadbeat, and so she was more or less like a surrogate mother for him. But then they had a falling out. He hasn't seen her for a while, and she was definitely the mother figure in his life, and so it was very devastating for him when he lost her. He has throughout his life developed some like OCD type tendencies and tics and things that he does, which prominently feature in the book. So there's a lot of backstory for Agent Brodsky, as far as like his personality, his quirks as a person, but then also his family background. And that's not even introducing the fact that like there's so much talk about punk music in this book as well.
Yeah, I mean, he grew up with punk music and activism in his family. So, and then he's faced kind of with some of these same elements coming up during the course of this this particular investigation. One thing I want to say, and you know, I don't know, I guess I don't know a lot about anything, but I don't know a lot about the condition that he has. But what I will say is I kind of like the fact that Nik decided to go a route where, let me rewind a little bit. When you see people with odd tics and stuff and odd mannerisms from some type of like OCD or a similar condition, they're always portrayed as like really weird, kind of like not cool guys. And not that Brodsky is portrayed as like the coolest guy, but he's portrayed as like a normal guy with odd quirks. And I kind of like that, because he also could have been like Monk is the one that comes to mind right away from TV. You know what I mean? Or I can't remember his name, but from a show we both loved, Boston Legal. The guy who, do you know what I'm talking about? Like,
I feel bad not knowing that character's name.
But my point is, whenever you see somebody who has tics, like, they always have to, and I'm not saying necessarily this about Brodsky, but they're like, oh, they always have to flip a light switch on and off 4 times. Like, they're always portrayed as like the weird, maybe creepy, but at least nerdy, if nothing else, guy. And Brodsky doesn't come across like that. He comes across as a regular guy who has like these impulsive quirks.
Jerry was the name of the character in Boston Legal.
That was totally Jerry. Very good.
I looked it up on IMDb, so don't give me too much credit.
All right. I was like, man. But the second you said it, I was like, that's absolutely what his name was.
Yeah.
But do you get what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Like, even in like that was one of the reasons I never watched the show Monk, was because it looked like they were using, it was being used as opposed to like being normalized. You know what I'm saying? Like, it was like for effect. Like, oh, imagine all the jokes and the side stories and the stuff we can use if this person has this particular affliction, instead of like in Boston Legal, like you mentioned, that guy starts out being disadvantaged by it because no one ever cared for him, and turns into like realizing his potential because he was encouraged.
Yeah.
And I think
agree.
this book, it doesn't do the happy ending Jerry's type story, but it doesn't do the Monk like exploitative type approach. It hits like right in the middle, where it's just like, this is a part of this person's personality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it was well done, because I'll be honest, when it pretty much opens on him, his scene or whatever pretty much opens on some of his like kind of stranger compulsive mannerisms, right? And I thought to myself, like, ugh, I don't want to do a whole book with, you know what I mean? Like,
Right.
but that was my initial thought. And I was like, okay, well, it comes up, you know, when he's stressed and under certain situations. But other than that, he's just like me or you, you know? Well, probably more like you, but you know what I mean? Like,
Well, and honestly, like, thinking about the approach that he took with his character, it almost turns into an advantage because he knows how to see a situation going out of control and like stop and change it so that it becomes in control. Whereas like if someone goes through life without weird impediments, like when they're faced with adversity, they might just not know what to do. So like it's almost turned into like a benefit that he's got this thing he has to control, because then it helps him know how to control other situations later in the book. I don't know if that was
think about
intentional
that,
or
but
not.
that's an interesting thought. I didn't think of it that way, but I see where you're going with that.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
The rest of the book, you know, I don't know how much more we can talk about it. It's not a terribly long book. I think the listening time is like 6 hours and 15 minutes. Rob, you listened to it all today. How long did you spend on it?
I did listen to it all today. It was it's like 6 hours and 40 minutes or something like that.
Okay.
So it was a good chunk of my day. So basically today was Radical's day, because when I'm not listening to it, I'm recording a podcast reviewing it.
There you go.
And some food happened in between.
So I think at this point, it's probably a good idea to talk a little bit before we go into wrap-ups about, I guess, about the audiobook experience. And the reason I say that is, I'll back up a little bit. I've never liked audiobooks. I've listened to a handful. But recently my commute to work changed a few months ago. And I did take the opportunity to listen to, I think it was 3 or 4 fiction audiobooks over the first, I don't know, month and a half, 2 months of having this commute. So I'm a little more used to it now than I was if this would have dropped in, say, you know, March of this year. But there are some interesting things. For me, one of the challenges is, and I guess this happens with reading regular books too, is that if I start thinking about something else, I'll just realize that oh man, I don't even know what I read on this page, but I just go back to the top of the page. The thing I have is with the audiobook, I don't do that. I don't like try to rewind and be like, well, I don't know, maybe I zoned out for 2 minutes, so like try to skip back 2 minutes.
Right.
Like I would with a paper book. Now some of that might be because I'm driving, so I'm not really screwing around with my phone and stuff while I'm, you know, I listened to it exclusively while I was driving to and from work. So that's one of the things that I would say is a maybe a pitfall of an audiobook for me.
Well, and I guess I have a unique perspective on that, because I decided, so I'm going to be completely honest. I knew that I had like a date Friday night. So I kind of cleared Friday and Saturday just to not have to worry about doing anything but, like, you know, whatever happens with, you know, going out with this person. So, but I was also lazy during the week, so I basically pushed myself into a situation where I had to listen to the entire book today. And not ideal for an audiobook in general, but yeah, that's been one of, and honestly, like, I want to go back to when we interviewed Jeffrey Craner about the book Welcome to Night Vale, because I was very excited that they started releasing their podcast episodes as books, because listening to Welcome to Night Vale while I drove never worked for me, because I would space out for like a minute and lose the entire thread of the story. So two big thoughts out of this are: don't listen to an audiobook in 6 hours and 45 minutes of straight listening, because that's torturous. And the second thought is, I fully agree. If you lose the thread, like, especially if you're driving, it's more difficult than just saying, all right, well, I'm going to go back and catch up on the last few pages, because there's just different factors involved. So it's harder to kind of catch up on that time.
Yeah. It's, I mean, look, it serves a purpose, right? Because I can't, you know, my commute to work's about 45 minutes each way, right? So I obviously can't read a book in that time frame. So if you want to consume something that's not, you know, whatever, the hairband station on your satellite radio, or, you know, whatever, a podcast, like, it's a viable source. But I think, I don't know, I feel like I was too easily drifted off. Like I had to like keep pulling my focus back because I just like you're on your way to work and you're like, all right, well, what do I have to do today? Oh shit, I've got this thing that's due today that I've got to get done. And then I'd be like, I have no idea what happened, and I don't know for how long I haven't been listening to the guy talking out of my radio.
Right, it's a real problem for sure.
One of the other things I wanted to mention, first of all, Scott Aiello, not that I recognize the name, but in looking at his bio, yeah, I recognize this guy. I watched a couple of shows that he was in, The Path and The Newsroom. So he looks familiar. Not a main character in either one of those that I remember, but he definitely looks like a familiar guy. So he's an actor. It's interesting because I noticed that there were two narrators. And correct me if I'm wrong. So it's Scott Aiello and Isabel Keating.
Yep.
Am I correct that Isabel Keating only appears in one section, like 2/3 of the way into the book, where some audio recordings are found?
You are 100% correct about that.
It was so weird because I was like, well, when's this woman coming along? And then I started thinking, I'm pretty sure it's the same dude as doing Vargas's voice. So then I was trying to listen to see if Vargas maybe is a woman who sounds like a man pretending to be a woman with a like a Spanish accent. And I couldn't. Yeah, it was.
The other actor doesn't show up until like 80% into the book, so it's like, when is this woman showing up?
Yeah. But you have to give credit. I didn't want to get into a whole conversation about the voice acting or the voice reading or whatever we want to call this, and break up the flow of the story. But I have to imagine, I don't even know if Yemen was supposed to sound like that. It's that this guy has to come up with something like 24 unique voices to use during the course of this book. So for all we know, Yemen maybe isn't described as having any kind of accent, but he has to be able to differentiate Yemen from...
Right.
But there's like at least 7 other men's voices he does in this.
Yep.
So I imagine that Mr. Aiello probably has, I don't know, like 20 standard voices. And he's like, look, this is what I can do. And like, that's it.
Yeah. And I was hoping that we would get into this because I have some thoughts about it. First of all, I want to give him immense amounts of credit for doing like Hispanic or Latin voices. Because there's a few characters that are from South America. Vargas is one of them, and it's a female voice that's either Hispanic or some sort of Latinx voice, and he does it very well. But he also does like the like straight English speaking voices very well. But yeah, like it would go from like me and Livia sound as similar enough where you couldn't really, I mean, obviously our voices are different and everything, but I couldn't differentiate, but like he'd go from like, if my grandfather was on the podcast for some reason, he'd be like, oh, and then Robb says all of this. And then his grandfather says, and then I went to the fort, and so he does do like very, like a variety, a spectrum of vocal differences, which I thought, it took a little getting used to, but I'm assuming that that's what a typical audiobook does, is if they have basically one consistent narrator or one consistent voice actor throughout the whole thing, they go through a spectrum. And I feel like he handled it well, but I really don't have much to like, gauge off of or differentiate from.
Yeah, and I get what you're saying about it being weird, and that's one of the other reasons I'm glad that this wasn't the first audiobook I've listened to in like 10 years or whatever. I listened to the audiobook for The Chain, which was that kind of big splash book probably like a year ago. Mm-hmm. And the lady who did the narration for that, like, did all the women's voices like perfect. But then when she would do guys, it just sounded like your girlfriend mocking you every time. You know what I mean?
Well, and I wonder, like, because you said that, I'm wondering, from a man's perspective, does a woman always sound like she's mocking you? And from a woman's perspective, does a guy just always sound like they're pretending like that they're also mocking? Like, is that like...
Well, it could be.
Like a gender perspective type thing?
It could be. But I guess my point is that there's got to be a suspension of disbelief if you listen to audiobooks. If they're not a full cast, audiobook where you have, 15 different voice actors doing the... And that was my other thought about Isabel Keating was, man... Is that it? Like he just doesn't have another woman voice that he can do, so like they had to bring someone in because he does so much of this. Well, it's probably like you said, the Isabel Keating doesn't show up till probably 80% of the way into the book,
right?
And she's in it for maybe 3%, because even the part she's in, he's opposite her. So it's not like she just gets a 15-minute section of,
right?
You know what I mean? So, and again, not shortchanging any of them. It's just one of those things that's good to know that you're going to hear voices that don't sound real normal or natural, but that's because somebody who's really fucking talented has to do more voices than you can do. By the way, my grandfather impression, awful.
Well, that's good. It's a good thing I'm not a voice. Well,
yes.
Now I'm not going to go auditioning for voice actor roles. But so to kind of put context on, without revealing too much or spoiling anything, the only part of the book that has a female voice actor is where essentially there's like it's referring to something that happened in the past. So it's not necessarily like an audio transcript, but it's like the effect of a transcript, where there's a very specific male part of the conversation, a specific female part of the conversation, where I guess what I'm saying is this is the only part of the book that's not specifically like dialogue from character to character. It's more referring back to something that happened like in the past, like a police transcript kind of thing. So that's the only reason I could think that would be recorded differently than all of the other stuff that was happening and just done all by Scott Aiello. Because it's like it's a different type of dialogue that's happening than the rest of the book. And I probably took too long to explain that.
That's okay. I love listening to you talk just in your normal voice. So
this is my grandpa talking, and he agrees with me.
Jesus Christ, he's talking through one of those microphones you put up to your neck when you've smoked for too long.
He's got a trach ring.
Yeah. Yeah, so definitely the experience is different. Before we get into our wrap-ups, I will say I still prefer, I was going to say the printed page, but really the digital page. So I still prefer words on a surface that I can read. But I mean, it's definitely not my last audiobook. And like I said, that's circumstance. I used to have a drive that was probably 6 minutes to get to work. So an audiobook was pointless because I can't really listen while I'm at work, and I'm probably not going to listen to an audiobook at home. I think they're a fair way. I mean, I don't know that the story would have affected me any differently than it did had I have read it on paper. And that's really kind of the whole thing about talking about this was to ask you the question: do you feel in any way different about this had you have read it as a traditional book versus an audiobook?
Yes. And so I'm glad you asked that question, because I was texting with someone earlier today, this lady friend of mine, and I'm trying to find the text messages because I explained it pretty well. But they she asked how the audiobook was going or how the audiobook was. And I said I liked it, but I still think that I'd prefer to read stuff, print or like ebook. And this is actually a great experiment for me because I got to see what taking in a book for a review would be like differently. What it comes down to for me, especially when I'm trying to be critical and analyze what's going on in a story, is a person's voice adds inflection and tonation to words that may be different than what my mind would interpret them as. So that's part of it. But then also the pace of a book that's read by someone doesn't give me the opportunity to pause as easily to reflect on or think about the thing I just read as reading it in print does. So I think that from a reviewing perspective, I think that there's benefits to print words that you don't necessarily get as easily in an audiobook. But what I will say is that I imagine that the more audiobooks you consume, the easier it is to adapt to that medium and understand it and process it better. So it might just be that I'm so new to the medium that there's a learning curve or something.
For sure. I think you're right. I wasn't thinking like from a review standpoint. From a review standpoint, it sucks, and here's why. Because regardless of if we do quotes or anything anymore, one of the reasons I love reading on my Kindle is that I highlight passages, and then before we do the review, I just go in and I look at my highlights. So sometimes I'll make an actual text note, but a lot of times I'll be like, well, why did I highlight this paragraph? And I'd be like, oh, because this is the part where this happened, and I want to talk about this in spoiler talk. You know what I mean? And I guess, in theory, the Audible app allows you to, like bookmark sections, but I'm not going, you know what I mean? I didn't do it, and I wasn't going to go back and listen to parts to. So basically, from a reviewer standpoint, I just had to depend on, making mental notes of things that I liked or didn't like, or whatever the situation was, things to talk about regarding the story. So from a reviewing standpoint, yeah, audiobooks suck.
And yeah, again, maybe if that was all we ever did, we would like develop our skills differently to be able to adapt to that, or just at least get a rhythm down where we could pause and take notes or some bullshit like that. But I fully agree. I would much rather have a print book. But then, all right, so imagine if you and me were both blind and all we had was audiobooks. We would probably rock the shit out of getting used to audiobooks, right?
That's very true. But see, if we had to do it all the time, dude, I would do that thing. And I already know what you're going to say, but I would do that thing where I'm listening to them at 2.5 speed.
That hurts my soul.
Well, I know, but think about this, right? Like when you're in a time crunch or whatever, right? And this goes back to what you were saying. Even if I look at my watch and I go, shit, I only got like 5 minutes left on lunch and there's like 7 pages left in this chapter, I pick up the reading pace. So I do it.
Okay.
I just do it myself instead of hitting a button that does 1.5 times. I just increase my reading to 1.5 times instead of the more leisurely pace that I like. But yeah. I know. And I do want to credit. I know you said it, and I kind of poked fun at you before, but I love that you listen to this all in one sitting. Like you typically read a book that we're reviewing in one sitting, so that you really tried to like match up.
Right.
I'm going to get this all done in one day.
Let's pretend that I did it for science, and I wanted to see what the difference was. And that was the outcome. It is nice though to have a good, accurate comparison, because at the most this would have been a 2-sitting read probably.
Oh yeah.
So it's nice to have a decent comparison. But like honestly, the thing that, again, we said it before, but the thing that was the most challenging thing was attention span, like letting my mind wander, which is never a problem when I'm reading, because if I find that my mind is wandering when I'm reading, I just put the book down and I go and I watch a video on YouTube for 10 minutes or whatever, and then I go back to reading. Because I'm like kind of satisfying that like my brain needs something else. And I don't feel like I was going to do that with the audiobook. I was setting time aside specifically for listening. And yeah, it was a very different experience. Should we do wrap-ups?
Before we move on to wrap-ups, I do want to say, because I've been staring at Scott Aiello's bio the whole time, as an audiobook person, you can win an Earphones Award, and you can also win, or at least in this case be nominated, for an Audi Award, which is not the same as like you've got the nicest like German car. Audi, AUDIE award. So I was not aware that either one of those were actual reward categories, but there you go. Earphones and Audis.
Oh man, I have to look, because I know a handful of voice actors. Mm-hmm. So I'm gonna have to go see if they've ever won any awards now.
You have to go shame them for not being nominated for an Audi award, like Scott Aiello.
Why aren't you as good as Scott Aiello?
Yeah. So yeah, let's do wrap ups. You go first this time.
Dude, it's Nik Korpon. He's been a buddy of ours since the very beginning of this podcast, and even when we weren't reviewing his stuff, I know Livius. See, I'm on the listening kick in my mind. I can't switch gears, but Livius read By the Nails of the War Priest, and he gave a great review of that, which we didn't review. But his story and the book anthology, top notch. The books that we've reviewed from him have been top notch. I just think he has a wonderful storytelling mind. And actually, honestly, because I know him, I think one of the things that I appreciated most about this was that it was very local to him, because he lives in Baltimore. And so we were getting a very non-The Wire look at what Baltimore is like, which I appreciate. That's a special dig at friend of the podcast, Missy, who, when we first became friends, was mad at me because I thought The Wire was just okay. But Nik is a wonderful storyteller, and he has a knack for crime fiction. I know that the last two books that we reviewed from his, of his were science fiction, and I think that he did a wonderful job of those. And I remember us liking both of those books very much. But he does crime in a way that's just very comfortable. Like, it feels very natural. It feels like when he's writing crime like this is, that it just makes sense. So it's easy to absorb and appreciate. And that definitely came through in the telling of this story. As far as this book goes, I think that the strongest part of the book was the actual story itself, and how it unfolded, and definitely, like, there was a lot of personal character stuff involved with the way that the story unfolded, which I'm not going to talk about because it's going to spoil stuff. But the actual story and what it was about and how it played out was really my favorite part of the story. But he's just a great storyteller. I was engaged, and I think that the fact that it was an audiobook was probably the most disarming part of anything, because it's just not a medium I'm used to. But that's absolutely no fault of his. It was a great story. It was engaging, and I was really interested in the characters and what the motivations of all the characters were. And I think that the conclusion of the story was very satisfying, because we won't talk about this. We're not going to do a spoiler talk of it, but it could have absolutely gone in multiple directions. But the way he took it really paid off for my particular emotional investment in how the story was playing out. All of that said, I gave it 8 out of 10. I really like the story, and I know that being an audiobook only might be like a barrier to entry for certain people, but I think it's worth checking out because, like I said, throughout all of this, he's just a really, really good storyteller. So I think it's definitely worth checking out.
I agree with everything Rob said, so I'm not going to rehash any of that. There's a part of the book. Part is probably not the right word. There is a thread throughout this book. So I mentioned that, you know, there's activism, right? That's the Crimson Ghosts, right? Like, they're wiping out medical debt, and it does expand from there. What I really found interesting and enjoyable was Nik's really solid feeling take on the activist side of it as the antagonists. And then, obviously, as somebody who works for the FBI side as a, law and order, type person. And really, it felt like doing a good job of balancing the motivations for both, and really representing both of them in what seemed to be a fair, and, I'm not an activist and I'm not an FBI agent, right? But it felt like a good, balanced portrayal of both sides of this particular
conflict.
Yeah, conflict. Thank you. It's really easy, especially in this type of book. And when I say this type of book, this is the most mainstream thing I've ever, I was going to say read, but this is the most mainstream story I've seen of Nik's, meaning, easy, wide appeal, stuff that's fairly interesting to and approachable for basically any kind of reader. I think it's really easy for authors to demonize the villain, typically, right? So it's just the, this super criminal that we're at, and it's hard, I think, to fairly portray the motivations in it, and it's just easy to make them out to be bad guys. And he didn't do that here. It was a very good balance between the motivations for one side and the motivations for the other. So, quite honestly, it was probably my favorite part of the book, was to see a very balanced approach where whatever your feelings are on what was going on in this book, I don't know that you'd be let down regardless of which side of the conflict you were on. I feel like both sides were represented very fairly. So I thought it was a fun story. I mean, all the punk rock stuff was great. The characters, you know, like I said, I don't know. Again, when I asked you, I didn't really talk about how I would have felt about the story differently. I don't know what voices Scott Aiello used that I liked or didn't like, or how that affected me, or how I would have hurt him in the head. But all in all, it's very enjoyable stuff. It's very approachable and mainstream. And I came in just a hair under Robb after averaging out my scores at 7.88. Overall, 7.9375. I'm still waiting for that number to get on a book somewhere.
Yeah, Audible, jump on this. 7.9375 out of 10 from the Booked podcast.
Speaking of which, this episode is not brought to you by Audible, where you can get a free trial, free 30-day trial. You can actually get Radicals for free on Audible just by going to their website and clicking a button.
Which I recommend doing. I think it's a nice book to dip your toes in. I think Scott did a good job. Nik wrote a great story, and that Isabel woman showed up for a little bit too. So there's 3 reasons right there, at the very least. Plus our 7.9375 rating. You should definitely get this. Make that your trial.
There's some shenanigans going on there with that Isabel Keating too. That she was also in The Path. So I don't know.
Oh.
There seems to be something going on there, maybe with her and Scott Aiello. Not sure.
Do you think that there's like first of all, let's get back to like the accent that she used. I want to acknowledge the accent that she used, but like, do you think that there's like house voice actors or something, like a specific? Well, it's an Audible original, so I'm assuming Audible paid for it. But like, do you think that there's like groups of actors that just kind of get lumped together in recordings and stuff?
My only exposure to this prior to, like thinking about it right now is in anime dubbing. And I know for certain there is, because if you watch one anime and then you catch another one, you're like, oh, hey, this is the woman that did the voice of so-and-so. And then later on, you're like, hey, that voice sounds really familiar too. And you realize it's also another. So I don't know how much smaller that community maybe is, but I would imagine that's probably the case.
Yeah. And there's definitely like producers and directors that are involved. So like maybe they just carry over the voice actors that they're like familiar with or comfortable with or whatever. Yeah.
Some of it too might be location, if you record at a studio, then it's whatever. There's voice actors in, New York and LA and whatever, Houston, Texas. And you wind up,
or agency representation or something, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. Be kind of interesting to get a voice actor on and talk about all these things.
I know voice actors. I can make that happen.
There you go.
If that's something that you want and you're a listener of this podcast, let us know, and we can maybe like dig into the background of. You know what? I don't know if my voice actors are audiobook voice actors though, so I'm going to put a caveat there.
Oh, I guess they could do like voiceovers for like cartoons,
commercials.
I was like, what? I was like, what else could they do? But I guess there's a lot of
anything non-physical acting, basically.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. All right, let's move off of audiobooks and let's not do another audiobook for a while. I guess I think we can both agree one audiobook a year is probably enough for us.
Yeah. Well, you know what? If the sequel to this book comes out 4 months from now, I'm down. But like, yeah, I'm probably going to want to pace myself a little bit with the audiobooks.
Well, I just wanted to free up my listening time, and I don't know if listeners know this. I don't know if we've actually talked about it on the podcast, but I guess I'm going to put you on the spot. Robb has been working on another podcast project that may or may not ever see the light of day, is my understanding. But do you want to tell listeners a little bit about it?
Yeah, sure. It's honestly like I think this part of this at least came out of. I'm going to say this a different way. I don't believe that this project would exist if there wasn't a global pandemic happening right now. That being said, so me and a couple of people that we mentioned on the podcast already. So it's me and 3 other guys, Adam and Oshkosh, whose legs don't work, and John Gatwood, and then our friend Nate, who is the least participatory in things like this, like podcasts and other types of like public things. We all grew up together, and we all met like in the 3rd grade. And so we've known each other for 3 decades plus. And Adam had the idea. I'm going to do a little background. Adam is married, and he has 2 kids. He's been married for like 12 years. John is married. He has a kid. Nate, married, has a kid. I'm single and have no kids. So I think the motivations are different for each of us. But like Adam at one point said, hey, why don't we get together and record essentially a podcast of remembering our friendship and growing up together. And that would be a great thing to just have kind of a record of our experiences of being friends and being friends throughout the decades, which is probably not something that everybody can identify with. So we've been getting together every other week and recording for, approximately like 2 hours or so. And just talking about the weird stuff we got up to as like kids, but then also throughout the years. So it's interesting. It's interesting to see 4 different perspectives on the shit that we went through, as children and growing up and everything. So it's been an interesting project. And like Livia said, I don't know how this is going to see the light of day. And honestly, like, even if it does, I don't know who's going to be interested in seeing it, but it's actually like been pretty fun to go back and relive some of the memories that maybe are 20 plus years old.
So here are my thoughts on that while you were talking, and I've known about this for weeks. And this was really like a really long-winded way for me to set you up so that you can tell me something that you started to tell me before the podcast. But yes, I think that would actually be fun to do with childhood friends for the participants. I guess the interest level would be in how interesting and fun, not necessarily your lives were, but like how interestingly you present them. And I, for listeners, right. I have not heard any of this. I have met Adam and John on multiple occasions, right? So, but I don't know how this plays out with the dynamic between the 4 of you. Well, but that's what I'm saying. If it's presented right. in a way, it could look. If I were flipping through YouTube or whatever, and some title caught my eye and I clicked on, I could probably totally listen to a couple dudes just shooting the shit about something. If the interaction was good, and the stories were okay, but I think really it's more about people than it is about like the things you did. Like, listen, I know you guys, and I know that when you got up to wacky shit, you guys probably weren't like murdering people or like robbing banks or doing anything like high interest for people to listen to. But I don't know how much that matters if it's presented in the right way.
Yeah, and honestly, so I took a very similar approach to the way that we do the podcast, in as much as, especially when we do interviews, my approach is don't talk until I need to make it interesting, kind of like as long as the discussion can support itself, I don't say anything. So my approach to this particular project is let it be interesting and steer it when I need to. And the only, I guess, X factor of that is like, what's the definition of interesting? Because like the things that are interesting to us are probably very much inside stories, but hopefully there's enough universal, like if I told a story about like, John getting a wedgie in the bathroom, you weren't there for that, but maybe you remember a wedgie story in your life that, it resonates with or something. So that was kind of my goal, was let the guys talk and enjoy the conversation as much as possible, and then steer it when I felt like it wasn't going in a direction that was going to be like productive.
Thinking about all the wedgies I gave people in bathrooms.
You were the giver of the wedgies. Yeah. I don't think
I was not. Yeah. I was not, but that's the character I play on this podcast at least. So really what I was getting to is you guys had a special guest, and this is what I want to hear about. And because I want to hear about it, everybody listening has to hear about it too.
Yeah. So we have recorded a week ago, basically, was our 5th recording, and they're all approximately like 2 hours each. And I haven't done anything with any of them. I haven't edited them. And they're also video recordings. You can see us the whole time. But in the 5th recording, the special difference, the change in that recording compared to the others was that Adam and Oshkosh, whose legs don't work, is the Adam in that thing. His mom joined us essentially for the whole time. Like his mom was on the recording, and the idea was maybe she's got a different perspective of how we were as kids than we do, or at least like she has a different take on how things went down and stuff, or just like an impression of us as friends in general. And so she joined us for nearly 2 hours of discussion about us as kids, which was very entertaining. And like my joke was, I was worried about. So our discussion for the first 4 recordings was, pretty mundane, pretty like, oh, remember the time that we ditched high school to do this. And my joke was that I was worried that Adam's mom would make it too offensive for the general public, and she did not disappoint. Like penises were mentioned 6 minutes into the recording.
Well, see, now you want to know how you make it interesting for people. That's exactly it. My first thought on that was, well, Jesus, I'm almost 48. You're almost 42, right?
Yeah, I'll be 42 in like 4 days.
Yep. So my thought is, I guess my question for you is this: does introducing a parent, so a parent, someone you know as a parent, meaning like this person was kind of around, I don't know how much time you spent at like Adam's house or whatever, right? But doesn't introducing a parent, no matter what age you are, and a parent of your friends, I guess would be a more accurate way to do that, make you feel like a kid, like you have to mind your P's and Q's even though you're in your fucking 40s?
If it was any other person's parent, I would absolutely agree.
Fair. That's fair, because after what you just told me, but my thought was, man, I could totally not be myself. Even your mom, who I've only met a handful of times. I did not know her when I was 12 years old, right? I would probably act a little differently on this podcast if she was the co-host of the week.
Yeah.
So
yes. Yeah. Honestly, we all knew we all knew why she was like the ideal parent guest. Mm-hmm. And all of us had, John's lost both of his parents, so that doesn't count. But me and Nate both kind of said, I don't know if our parents would be into, I don't know if my mom would be into it. I don't know if his mom would be into it. But we knew that Adam's mom would be the best parent to get, because she was the one who was just like, she was a wonderful mom. I'm going to say this first of all, like, and that actually comes through in the recording, like, because Adam's the one who had a disability growing up, and she was the one who fought so hard to make sure that he had the same life as everybody else. So she was a wonderful mom, but she was also absolutely the most inappropriate parent of anybody. And so we knew that there was going to be that balance of like, approaching sainthood, but at the same time, like, really, really inappropriate discussion.
Which is fine. Like, you don't typically think of those two things being, happening simultaneously, but
right.
I guess I don't see why it couldn't, you know?
Yep.
So, well, there you go, listeners. If that ever meets the light of day, episode 5 apparently is the one you need to be ears out for, eyes out for. It's a video podcast. Can't wait to watch your podcast.
Oh man, sorry. Yeah, that'll be the only time that's not annoying.
Yeah, throwback to something we haven't talked about in years on this podcast. But yeah, so is there anything else you'd like to talk about before we talk about what may or may not happen over the next couple of weeks?
I feel like I talk too much, so like I would say I would kick it over to you. Otherwise, I'm good.
Fair enough. Here is a look at the next few weeks. Next week, potentially we'll have an interview. If not, there will be an interlude as we take a break from not reading a book and listening to a book this week. But we're going to take a time out from consuming stories for a week. And then, and I'm going to just kind of lightly tease this, we're probably going to have like a crossover podcast thing happening. That's still in, like, we're going to do this. We're just not exactly sure from a scheduling standpoint how this is going to work. I think it's okay to say, right?
Yes.
Okay. We are going to be doing a crossover podcast with the fellas from This Is Horror. So we haven't done this in a couple of years. We did have Michael Wilson on earlier this year to talk about his novella, but we will be joining, I hope, Michael and Bob Pastorella for a Halloweeny crossover. We'll be talking about a novella that they're putting out for Halloween. So that's something I'm looking forward to reading in the next couple of weeks, although I don't know that that'll be like a proper review. We haven't quite worked out all the details yet. And then, we're going to have a Halloween episode, of course, with special guests, permanent co-hosts. I don't remember what we're calling them, Jesse and Misty. So we will have our Halloween extravaganza spectacular, as we have every year for the last several years. Then there'll be, I guess I'll let you talk about that following episode, since I won't be on it.
Yeah, so first of all, I want to say this is going to be my first Halloween spectacular, Halloween extravaganza, spooktacular, whatever you want to call it. It's whatever title we're using, in my new apartment. So I'm going to have to try and figure out a way to make it look all like creepy and Halloween-y. So I'm excited about that. But much like Livius has done a couple of times in the past, where he had Frank Edler co-review a book with him, correct?
Yes, we did. We did something with Frank, Mannequin, something or another.
Terror Mannequin, is that what the one you did?
Terror Mannequin, that's the one.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then also with Dino Parenti, you did The Mister by E.L. James.
I did. Yep.
Livius is going to take a break, kick his feet up on the desk and put his hands behind his head, while me and one of our permanent co-hosts that was mentioned earlier, Misty Bennett, are going to take a couple of weeks, maybe a week or two, to talk about a book by author John Douglas, who is the author of the book Mindhunter, which inspired, obviously, the Netflix series Mindhunter, who has a new book coming out called The Killer's Shadow, which is a true story about his hunting of a white nationalist serial killer. And the hope is, at the very least, it's going to be a book review. Fingers crossed, there's also going to be an interview that follows that up as well. So it's very exciting for us. And the reason that Misty Bennett was chosen as the co-host for this is because she is absolutely much more knowledgeable about true crime in general, but also John Douglas's other work, including the fact that she read Mindhunter in the past. So when I mentioned that was an option to my besties, I was like, hey, this popped up. She freaked out. And so I was like, why not take someone who is more of a
aficionado.
Yeah. I was going to say authority on the subject, and have that person as a co-host, and give Livius the opportunity to maybe kind of relax a week or two and just kind of like catch his breath, because it's been, I don't know if we mentioned this, but like 15 episodes or something since we've done an interlude, so we've been pretty busy. So give Livius a little rest and give us an opportunity to check out some true crime, because nonfiction is not something that we've done since our sixth review, which I believe so, almost 300 reviews ago.
Yeah. I am glad that you guys are able to do this. I was not, like, nonfiction does absolutely nothing for me. Like, I really I wouldn't have said no if you wanted to do this and Misty wasn't, down for it. But I do want to say I'm really glad that you qualified it, because I just thought that Misty wanted in on this because she was a serial killer groupie.
I mean, that might be the actual motivation, but like I'm couching it as like she's got credentials.
I like it a lot. So that's a loose look at the next 5-6 weeks, whatever that is, of booked. And then we're probably going to hit the fiction pretty hard in those last 6 weeks of the year, right? Like, we're going to kind of ramp up and try to knock down a bunch of books. So that's what it's looking like. I know it went longer than I thought it was going to, for sure. But thanks for listening. Definitely check out Nik Korpon's Radicals, an Audible original. Did you notice that at the very end they used a guy that sounded like he recorded that in like the 1970s? Like, this is Audible.
The credits, yeah.
Like, I'm pretty sure that must be the guy who was doing those for like books on tape when they were like on cassette.
Yep.
But then I was like, well, they couldn't have just taken that audio, because I don't think it was called Audible then. because Audible, I think, was invented, right, like 10 years ago or something. Yeah, so
You've been listening to a Houghton Mifflin recording.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, but yeah, that's it for this episode. Thanks again for listening. Please subscribe, like, comment, do all the stuff that we need you to do so that we can keep doing this. Until next time, I'm Livius Nedden.
And I'm Robb Olson. Keep reading.